Welcome to the Hoof Armor presentation of the military invention of horseshoes, how and why horseshoes were invented. So here's the theory. The common belief about the history of horseshoes is that horseshoes were invented to prevent wear when horses started being kept in castles. Do you agree? Horses are not domesticated animals, at least not in the same way as dogs and pigs. You can tell the difference between wild and domestic dogs and pigs by the shortening of the snout from the wild, among other things. Horses are primarily still wild, and nothing with their physiology and very little with their attitude has changed throughout our shared history. Would you agree that horses never quite lost their fight or flight instincts? It's what's for dinner. After we stopped hunting horses, we domesticated them. Early mankind was practical above all else. I imagine they were easier to eat if they weren't running away. Soil from a Copper Age site in northern Kazakhstan has yielded new evidence for domesticated horses up to 5,600 years ago. The Krasnaya Yar site was inhabited by people of the Botai culture of the Eurasian steppe, who relied heavily on horses for food, tools, and transport. There's very little direct evidence of horse domestication, says Sandra Olson, an archaeologist and horse domestication researcher at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Horses allowed the Botai to build large perennial villages with, in one case, hundreds of homes. They did so without the benefit of agriculture, Olson explained, as theirs was a horse economy. The Botai were able to stay put year-round because horses are very well adapted to cold winters, she said. Horses can survive ice storms and don't need heated barns or winter fodder, Olson said. They are, in fact, some of the last remaining large Ice Age Pleistocene mammals living in one of the last places on Earth where Pleistocene vegetation survives. The people who lived here grew no crops. 90% of the bones they left behind are horse bones, showing they mainly ate horse meat. A large settlement like this would have been difficult to feed on hunting alone. So archaeologists think it is likely that the people of this village raised domestic horses. Eating dust. The famous Sumerian stand-over mosaic painting from 2500 to 2400 BC depicts this earliest form of military wagon with four wheels drawn by four asses or ass-onager hybrids, together with a driver and a warrior armed with spears and axes. Carbon dating of the horse remains showed that the first evidence of lightweight war chariots pulled by horses began around the early part of the Middle Bronze period from 2200 to 2000 BC. This mosaic painting is from the 18th dynasty, from 1540 to 1307 BC. The top chariot is pulled by a horse, the bottom is pulled by mules. By the 15th century BC, Pharaoh Tutmosis III had over 1,000 chariots at his disposal. By 1400 BC, the great king of the Mitanni had amassed several times that number. I can imagine the dirt that kicked up. That's from the Oxford History of Ancient Egypt. Finally, on top. The first evidence of riding a horse was shown on a bronze ring in northeast China dating from the 8th to the 7th centuries BC, along with special bronze bits specifically used for riding. The same type of evidence was found in the south in the 6th century BC and the central plains around 4th century BC. In 307 BC, King Wuling of Zhao, the ancient Chinese ruler of the former state of Jin territory, ordered his military commanders and troops to adopt the trousers of the nomads as well as practice the nomads' form of mounted archery to hone their new cavalry skills. The adoption of mass cavalry in China also broke the tradition of the chariot-riding Chinese aristocracy in battle, which had been in use since the ancient Shang dynasty around 1600 BC to 1050 BC. The Syrian cavalry from reliefs of 865 to 860 BC show riders using bows from horseback. At this time, the men had no spurs, saddles, or stirrups. Fighting from the back of a horse was much more difficult than mere riding. The cavalry acted in pairs. The reins of the mounted archer were controlled by his neighbor's hand. Later images of Assyrian cavalry showed saddle cloths as primitive saddles, allowing each archer to control his own horse. Cavalry played a relatively minor role in the ancient Greek city-states, with conflicts decided mostly by massed armored infantry. The Macedonian kingdom in the north, on the other hand, developed a strong cavalry force of Philip II and Alexander the Great. The effectiveness of this combined infantry with heavy and light cavalry was demonstrated in Alexander's conquest of Persia and northwestern India. Alexander's horse, Bucephalus, died in battle at age 30. For the most part, Roman cavalry during the Republic functioned as an adjunct to the legionary infantry and formed only 1/5 of the military force. This is a carving from the tombstone of a Roman auxiliary trooper from Cologne, Germany, second half of the 1st century AD. Not much of a saddle there, and obviously there was no stirrups. The saddle and stirrups were inventions of war. The earliest known saddle-like equipment were fringed cloths or pads used by Assyrian cavalry around 700 BC. These were held on with a girth or a surcingle that included breast straps and cruppers. Eurasian nomads, known in Europe as Scythians, developed an early form of saddle with a rudimentary frame, which included 2 parallel leather cushions with girth attached to them, a pommel, and cantle with detachable bone, horn, hardened leather facings, leather thongs, a crupper, and breastplate. These were located in Pizrig burial finds. These saddles found in the Ukok Plateau, Siberia, were dated to 500 to 400 BC. Saddle development was for military applications. The replacement of the saddlecloth Roman saddle by variations of the Scythian model with pommel and cantle was also a significant factor. Although Roman cavalry had no stirrups, their horned saddle allowed the combination of a firm seat with substantial flexibility and provided greater efficiency in mounted shock combat. Saddles were improved upon during the Middle Ages as knights needed saddles that were stronger and offered more support. The resulting saddle had a higher cantle and pommel to prevent the rider from being unseated in warfare, and it was built on a wooden tree that supported more weight for the rider with armor and weapons. The invention of stirrups enabled a broader array of attacks to be delivered from the back of a horse. Stirrups were unknown in ancient times, and horsemen had to hold the horse's mane to avoid falling off. Cavalrymen of antiquity used their spears to mount a horse, hoisting themselves aloft as in pole vaulting. Mongol tribesmen brought the stirrup to Europe, and in the year 580, a military manual of the Byzantine emperor for the first time mentions the need for stirrups. As a greater weight of man and armor could be supported in the saddle, the probability of being dismounted in combat was significantly reduced. In particular, a charge with a lance couched under the armpit would no longer turn into a pole vault. This eventually led to an enormous increase in the impact of the charge. For mounted archers such as the Mongols, stirrups allowed them to stand up to fire arrows in any direction. This is a bas-relief of a soldier and horse with saddle and stirrups from the tomb of Chinese Emperor Taizong of Tang around 650 AD. If you look at it, it's very similar to the modern attack, with the saddle, stirrups, headgear, everything. The introduction of spurs allowed better control of the mount during a charge in full gallop. The earliest spurs were possibly made from wood or bone and probably took the form of the prick or prong spurs. The first recorded metal example of simple bronze spurs found in Etruscan tombs from the 2nd century BC. Others from that time have been found at Roman sites in Britain. They gradually changed in shape, developing plates that stopped the spike penetrating the horse's sides, or taking on a ball and spike form as seen in the Bayeux tapestry. That had the same function. Eventually, a pyramidal or conical shape goad developed. Rowels probably originated in France or Spain in the 10th century AD. They were first recorded in Britain in Henry III's reign. Two seals from 1240 depict the king. On one he wears prickspurs, on the other rowelled. Here are some pictures of military cavalry prick or prong spur in the upper right, and below that are example of ancient rowel spurs. As we can see by these developments, including the armored horse on the right-hand side there, warfare was incentive for many inventions concerning our relationship with the horse. Early hoof care practices. One of the earliest treatises on horse care, and specifically hoof care, was written by a Greek cavalry commander named Xenophon. His books, On Horsemanship and The Cavalry Commander, written around 350 BC, gave recommendations on how to take care of war mounts. Xenophon believed that all soldiers should be mounted, not infantry. Xenophon also stressed the importance of caring for the horse's feet. He suggested that the flooring of the stable should not be damp and should not be smooth, and that the stable should therefore be built with sloped channels of cobblestones the size of the horse's hoof. The stable yard should be of pebbles to strengthen the hooves and should be surrounded by a skirt of iron so that the pebbles do not scatter. These surfaces are intended to strengthen the hoof wall, frog, and sole of the horse. Along comes another invention of war. Around 2,300 years ago, a cruelly simple war device, the caltrop, designed similar to children's jacks, stopped drivers and riders in their tracks and forced them to address protecting one of their most critical assets, their horse's hooves. Caltrops consist of 3 or 4 spikes that, no matter how thrown, maintain one spike in a vertical position, ready to cripple a horse when stepped upon. The caltrop was designed to be thrown onto the field to create a minefield of potentially crippling obstacles for the oncoming mounted armies. Horses would encounter these extremely sharp obstacles at considerable speed, carrying the weight of rider and full armor. The caltrop would pierce the sole of the horse's hoof, causing serious injury and effectively halting the progress of the advancing army. Here's some pictures of various caltrop styles that were developed later. The word caltrop originally meant star thistle, a weed whose form and function were similar to those of the weapon. The original caltrop was nothing more than a ball from which 4 spikes projected in such a way that when 3 spikes were on the ground, the 4th was always pointed upward. In the Middle Ages, European smiths improved and simplified the caltrop design by eliminating the ball, twisting 2 double-pointed strips of iron, and cold hammering them together, similar to what you saw on the previous page. The caltrop now resembled more than ever the ground thistle from which it took its English name. Whatever its size, however, the caltrop was dangerous to man and beast. In fact, it is so potent an agent of infection, being exposed to contamination by soil and weather, that attempts to deliberately apply poison to it seemed unnecessary. Caltrops. Caltrops are used as early as 331 BC, according to Quintus Curtius, at the Battle of Arbela or Gaugamela in what was once Persia. The Persians spread caltrops across the battlefield to restrict Macedonian troop movement. When horses pulling chariots charged across the caltrop at full speed, the chariots were damaged and the horses were gravely injured. Despite the obstacle created by the caltrops, Alexander the Great of Macedonia was able to navigate through the caltrops and win this battle. He recognized the caltrops' worth as a weapon and used them against other enemies. Used as early as 4th century BC Rome, caltrops were mentioned by Vegetius in his De Re Militari. The armed chariots used in war by Antiochus at first terrified the Romans, but they afterwards made a jest of them. Roman soldiers rendered them useless by covering the field of battle with caltrops, and the horses that drove the chariots, running full speed on them, were infallibly destroyed. The first English settlers at Jamestown, Virginia, brought with them a supply of caltrops, ideal for discouraging surprise attacks by the American Indians should relations turn sour. Its use was revived during the Korean War when it was employed effectively by United Nations forces against sneaker-shod Chinese infantrymen. Today, the caltrop remains very much with us. It is used effectively by both military and the police against all vehicles running on pneumatic tires. Hoof protection for war. You can see why everyone would be looking for a defense against this little physical and psychological weapon called the caltrop. In warfare, any advantage can mean victory and even dominance. A wrapped hoof bore at least some protection from the caltrop's fierce spikes, and so the earliest hoof boot, a patch of hide that could be tied around the pastern, can credit its invention to the caltrop and occurred around the same time. An early form of hoof protection was also seen in ancient Asia for the same reason, where horses' hooves were wrapped in rawhide, leather, or other materials. For caltrop protection in China, a soft wooden block was attached to the leather boot. The hip sandal, which appears around the mid-1st century AD, was the next step in the development of hoof protection, where the sole of the boot was made of metal. It included an oval-shaped cup of thick metal that enclosed and protected the hoof, complete with a fixation system. The device was fastened to the hoof by metal clips and leather laces. To further improve traction, the bottom of each hippo sandal was grooved. This first metallic shoe probably gave the best protection against caltrops. It also lends credence to the concept for horseshoes being invented for defense against caltrops. Here's a good photo of some samples of what the hippo sandals look like. Later on, the Romans would attach a metal plate to the sole of the protective leather horse boot, which still later on eventually evolved into nailed-on horseshoes. Today's horseshoes are direct descendants of the shoes used by the Celts and modified by the early Romans. The evolutionary process of horseshoes has been a result of trial and error and often based on military considerations. These forms of hoof protection would have slowed a cavalry tremendously, so they were more than likely only used for protection against caltrops and only when caltrops were encountered. As metals were so valuable in those times, the usage of metal hoof protection to prevent wear would not have been practical. The nailed shoe was a relatively late invention. There is very little evidence of nailed-on shoes prior to AD 500, although there is recent evidence that the Celtic Gauls were nailing on metal horseshoes as early as 294 AD. By the looks of these horseshoes, they were not meant to just protect against hoof wear, but against caltrops. The wide web inward protected the sole besides the hoof wall. Protection against wear would not need such a wide, heavy horseshoe, and this design would work against the movement of the horse, restricting speed and mobility, two key factors of a mounted cavalry. Practicality was sacrificed for protection against the threat of caltrops, but could have been given a huge psychological advantage in a charge. Even horseshoe design into the 19th century had this inner wide web for sole protection. The farrier tradition grew out of warfare. War horses were taught to lash out with their hooves in battle. Adding iron horseshoes to their hooves enabled the horse to inflict more damage to its enemy, similar to using brass knuckles. Because iron was a valuable commodity also being used as currency, and any worn-out items were generally melted down and reused, it is difficult to locate clear archaeological evidence of the earliest shoes for horses. Only the wealthy could afford the early iron horseshoes. Here's a photo of some horseshoes from a Roman villa found in a river near Neapotz, Germany. They're dated to the year 294. The earliest example. This is an example of English horseshoes from the 11th century to the 19th. Note that they all have a wide inner web. So we have another military invention. A European innovation, castles originated in the 9th and 10th centuries after the fall of Carolingian Empire resulted in its territory being divided among individual lords and princes. These nobles built castles to control the area immediately surrounding them and were both offensive and defensive structures. They provided a base from which raids could be launched as well as protection from enemies. Horses were kept in the castle stables to protect them from theft and to take care of them as they belonged mostly to the nobles and the wealthy. So, for a dateline comparison, caltrops were in use from 331 BC, and leather hoof boots occurred around the same century. Hippo sandals were in use around 0 to 100 AD, right at the beginning of the millennium. The earliest horseshoes were found to be from 294 AD and were commonly in use around 500 AD. The earliest castles, however, were built in the 9th and 10th centuries, around from 800 to 900 AD. Now, why do you think horseshoes were invented? Back to the original theory, is that horseshoes were invented to protect the hoof sole. You can protect the hoof sole with hoof armor. Here's the contact information for getting hoof armor, and you can find a whole lot more information along with the blog and links to everything else at www.hoofarmor.com. Thank you.